how would I harvest if I wanted to have a very different pond and I wanted to be able to go out there and catch a bunch of big bluegill?
Yeah.
Because I enjoy eating bluegill a whole lot more than I enjoy eating bass. So what if that's my goal? What do I want to focus on there?
I'm going to, a little tangent, because I do think you made an important point there. A bluegill, a properly cooked bluegill, is one of the best fish you can eat.
Oh,
they don't get enough loving. So shout out to the little bluegill in the frying pan. But
welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gherkin. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing. Welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. It's fall, and we got cool nights. I'm really enjoying waking up in the morning and going out. I got out really early on Sunday, and it was actually so foggy that it kind of interfered with what I was doing, so I enjoyed that for sure. But even though it's starting to get cool, it's a good time to talk about ponds. So are we going to talk about fish?
We are. We're going to talk about some fish population management. You know, I love this time of year. You're getting hunting started up. A lot of people think after Labor Day you can't go fishing, and this is some of the best time of the year to go fishing, in my opinion. So excited to talk about fish a little bit today, Drew.
Why is it a good time to talk about fish, or to think about fish, or to even continue to fish after Labor Day?
Yeah, you know, we have a lot of different species in Kansas that you know, they just change their habitats once that water temperature starts to cool down a little bit from those peak summer highs. And so, you know, fish like walleye that are like cold water are starting to become a little bit more active. Some of the fish that have been up in the shallows that like a little bit warmer water, starting to get a little bit deeper. So it's just kind of fun. You know, you get that change in the fish population structure, and thinking about where those fish might be and how they might be acting is kind of fun to think about, fun to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I know as a catfish angler, getting out this time of the year in places where the regulations are fairly liberal about harvest, this gives me an opportunity to go out and fill my freezer up, because they're out there trying to pack on some groceries, I guess, to get them through the wintertime.
Yeah, groceries is a great term for it, and you can be doing that in your backyard pond too. So I want to talk a little bit about fish population structure in farm ponds, and harvest and fishing's a big part of that too.
Sure. So, I mean, what do we need to think about? Where do we need to start if we're wanting to manage a fish population in a pond?
You know, one of the big things that happens, I get a lot of calls and people say, hey, I just bought this property with a farm. Where can I stock it, right? And that's almost always how it leads in when someone gets a new pond. And one of the worst things you can do for a pond that you just bought is going out and stocking that pond, right?
Sure.
And so a bigger problem, a much more common problem, is that you have too many fish in that pond. There haven't been enough taken out. You end up with too many mouths to feed. And so, you know, kind of understanding what's in your pond is a great place to start getting out there and doing some fishing, setting out some minnow traps, see what kind of smaller fish or invertebrates. There might be crayfish or other organisms. We just talked about the importance of aquatic invertebrates in our most recent aquatic episode. So, you know, kind of understanding what's going on in your pond is where you'd want to start, looking at the fish species that are there, and then kind of making a plan of, hey, what can I do with that, right? So understanding, you know, the species, the size structure, and then how far do you want to take it? That's going to kind of depend on your goals and how much you really enjoy, you know, getting out there and actually managing that fish population.
Sure. So what are we looking for when we put those minnow traps out, or if we go fishing? I mean, what would be a sign that we needed to do something? Yeah.
So, and again, you know, here you can take the easy route. So you can just look at the fish, right, and see, do they look healthy? And even if you're not an expert, you know, if you look at a few fish, you can kind of get a good idea, right? So are they a little bit fatter? Are their heads, do they just look too big for their body? So if you're just kind of, you know, passing by, listening to the episode and want to just go look at something, just go look at the fish, kind of think about what they look like, and then take that information back. But understanding the species that you have. So in your minnow trap, are you catching young fish that have, you know, been hatched this year and grown up, so they're young of the year fish, you know, they're reproducing that year? Do you have signs of reproduction? Do you have minnows that that are maybe feeding some other fish, looking at the population structure. How many predators do we have? How many prey do we have? What's the size of each of those? In the past, we've talked about relative weight. And if you want to take that next kind of step of understanding, are your fish, what kind of shape are they really in? You want to start collecting some metrics, looking at the length of the fish and the weight of the fish and going back and calculating that relative weight. Good information that you could look at and figure out, hey, how are the fish really doing? But starting by looking is a great place to, kind of gather some of that information.
Very cool. Very cool. So, what are some of the most common pitfalls or things that people do wrong that you notice when you're helping folks and they get one of those new ponds and they go out there and they start doing stuff?
Yeah. I think a couple things. One, like I said, just throwing fish in there and not knowing what you're doing. That's a waste of money, and it can actually make the problem worse when you have good intentions. The other thing is being so overwhelmed or so nervous to do anything that you kind of freeze and don't do anything. So those things, and I imagine that's common, kind of similar issues with you. I know on my land, I get overwhelmed and talk to you, and you kind of say, hey, slow down and kind of do one thing at a time. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
So understanding that, but, not having a harvest plan is a really big thing. And so we've been taught that catch and release is the way to handle everything. And in a pond, that's just not the case. You need to be taking some mouths out of that pond. The biomass can only, there's only a certain number of fish that can be in that pond and thrive.
Sure.
And so, having a harvest plan, not always just catching and releasing. I think people have good intentions of, hey, I really like to catch crappie or like to want to feed my bass, so I'm going to raise some shad and throw those in there. So people have good intentions again, but don't understand really what's going to happen to the population or the dynamics of that fish community if you start throwing different species in there. So adding species that maybe aren't desired. Habitat management, we come back to that all the time on this podcast because it's so important in terrestrial environments and aquatic. And so thinking about habitat management, and it's, habitat management is great when you do it, but it's not just kind of a, hey, I put a tree in there 5 years ago, or hey, I burned a property 7 years ago, and so I'm good because I burned it once, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's ongoing efforts. So kind of understanding what a goal is, having a clear goal, physically writing out that goal and the steps you want to take, and then looking at that. I mean, it's okay if you don't follow it step by step, but the act of writing it out and having something to reference really is huge.
Sure. No, that makes sense. Having a plan is very important for a lot of things that we do. Let's say not even thinking about what I catch with a hook and line, but I've got a minnow trap out there, and there's a bunch of little bullheads that are a couple inches long, and there's a whole bunch of green sunfish that I'm catching in there and things like that. Is that a red flag, or is that different than what I want to be seeing, and what would I do about it if I saw something like that? Yeah,
that's going to depend on a lot of different things. How close is it to another water body, for example? Are you also catching adults in that system? Do you have some sort of established predator base that can maybe feed on some of those things? So some of those undesired species are definitely a concern, and the thing to do would be to start getting those out as soon as you have them, contacting a professional. If you get on that type of issue early, when you're first starting to see it, you have a small number of green sunfish or yellow bullhead that are in your pond, you can probably get in and do something about that, right? If they're established, it might be the case where if you really want to get it under control, you kind of need to start over. But gaining that information is definitely valuable, something that you definitely want to do, and know kind of your limitations too, right? Are you the type of person that can realistically take that information, do a little bit of searching for some information on how to handle it and then execute it, or do you need to call a professional in? And knowing that, there isn't a right or wrong answer there, but knowing it is important.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One of the things I've heard people say when they get a pond and it's out of balance, they've got maybe too many sunfish or too many undesirable species from their point of view. Well, let's just go to the river and catch a 50-pound flathead and put in there.
Yeah.
And is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing? Or
we're getting into a couple things there. So one, it is legal to harvest fish, as long as you harvest those fish legally, have all of the licensing requirements that you need, it is legal to move a fish. But when you start talking about, let's add a big flathead to a population, and flatheads almost exclusively want to eat live fish, right? Flatheads especially are picky, where they're not like some of the other catfish species that will eat a lot of different things. They want to eat live fish. And so adding a flathead in, flathead doesn't care if it's a bass swimming by or it's a bullhead swimming by or green sunfish. It's not just going to eat what you want it to eat. So understanding that, disease is a big thing. You can introduce a lot of disease by bringing fish in. And a very similar but tangential thing there is you might want to go to your buddy's place and catch a bunch of bass because he has some big bass that you can bring over to your pond, or he has a bunch of little bass that could grow up. And again, without knowing how old they are, what condition they're in, it's not really the most advisable thing. So it's something you legally can do. I don't know that I would ever recommend adding fish from somewhere else into your pond. Generally, getting those from a licensed producer is the way to go.
Got it. Well, I know, like in Kansas too, there's regulations about moving live fish from a body of water that's a designated aquatic nuisance species water too. So even if we're wanting to catch green sunfish for bait and then go use those as bait somewhere else, it's not legal to do that out of a ANS water.
Yeah, and aquatic nuisance species, the one most of us are familiar with is zebra mussel, but there are other species. And, understanding that, like you said, you're not allowed to take that water or any organisms from that body of water outside of that body of water. So definitely that's where understanding those regulations and making sure you're doing it correctly is important to do.
Sure.
The other thing you want to think about with the, your balance is understanding really the predator-prey balance in your pond. And so I think, are there a lot of bass but not a lot of bluegill, or are there a lot of bluegill but not a lot of bass? And understanding that dynamic will really help you give insight into if there's enough food there. A lot of times I'll go out to these ponds that haven't had anything happen in a really long time. They haven't been harvested. There hasn't been a lot of fishing activity. And you'll go catch cast after cast. You'll catch a 10-inch bass, right? And that's really indicative that there are too many mouths there. Those fish are stunted. The really important thing that I think a lot of people forget is that a 10-inch bass could be 6 years old, right? We tend to think that that's maybe a 2-year-old fish. But if there's so many mouths to feed that they're not getting the nutrition they need to grow, they could be really old. And if we start to think about population structure, even if we're able to take out a lot of those little bass, we're left with potentially a lot of really old, small, poor body condition bass or fish left in our pond, right? Same thing could happen with bluegill. I'm using the example of bass here, but in that example, it's really hard to get back to a fishery where you're going to feel like, hey, I'm catching 3, 4, 5 pound bass, and I really like this pond system that I have. So kind of understanding there's a cost benefit, right? So there's a financial side. There's also a time side. So you might be able to get that pond back. It might take 10 years. So do you have 10 years to invest in that pond, constantly working on it before you get back to where you want it to be? Or do you want to spend a little bit more money up front and in maybe 3 years have a fishery that fits kind of what you want to do? So a little bit of a tangent there, but I think that's a really important point to make.
Yeah, no, and that makes a lot of sense to me. So thinking about what you just said made me come up with a question that maybe some of our listeners would have. Is there a difference in growth potential between a 2-year-old bass that's 8-9 inches long versus a 6-year-old bass that's 8-9 inches long?
Yeah, definitely. So fish have indeterminate growth, right? So they're going to grow throughout their whole lifespan. If we look at how quickly a fish gets to a harvestable size, that's one of the things that we're going to be, kind of selecting for if we look at those relative weights. If females always are the big fish, so females grow bigger than males almost ubiquitously across all fish species. And so thinking about sport fish species and getting bigger fish, having the right population dynamics is important. And when we're thinking about age structure, just like there's a lot of growth early on, It's not necessarily that we can't get those 6-year-olds to grow, but we've lost all that time. So going from, a 10-inch bass that weighs a half a pound to a 14-inch bass that weighs 3/4 of a pound isn't as exciting as going from a 4-pound bass to a 4.5 or 5-pound bass. So as fish get bigger, their length and especially their weight can grow exponentially. So you can start to see, if you really want those big fish, you're going to have fish that have grown quickly and consistently throughout the whole time. I think that was a really convoluted way of saying, yes, it matters whether they're 2 or they're 6 when they're a certain length.
Well, no, I think that's good. Thinking about an analogy with people, when you're 16, 17, 18 years old and you're lifting weights because of athletics or something when you're in school, it's a whole lot easier to gain mass and strength really quickly. Whereas now that I'm 43 years old, if I try and work out, I might not be able to walk for a week.
That's right.
It's a lot different. And thinking about wildlife species, you don't want to change your age structure in a way where you're selecting only for old individuals, because there's all kinds of problems if you've got a skewed age structure. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
So if we are out of balance, you said that trying to harvest our way back into balance doesn't always work and may not always be the best option. So what are some other ways of getting back into balance?
Sure. If you're at that point, it's very hard to get back, right? And so a lot of times what they're going to do is kill off the pond, right?
Okay.
Bring in a rotenone agent where the fish essentially can't breathe, and you kill every fish in that pond and you start over like it's a new pond. And that can also happen naturally.
Sure.
Right? So we can see fish kills that happen in ponds where, oxygen levels drop and you end up with a bunch of dead fish, coming on. And so that's something that fish kills, I don't want to say they're a good thing. Fish kills are not a good thing, but the silver lining in a fish kill a lot of times is that the population in many of the ponds wasn't where it needed to be. So it gives you kind of a fresh start to start over. Two things really happen with a fish kill. There are fish kills that, the oxygen level slowly diminishes throughout the night, and then you get to the day and plants start to photosynthesize, and you start to see the oxygen levels go back up. And so depending on how low those oxygen levels go, you might have a few fish that die, and then they might be okay through the day. Or you can have a complete kill where the oxygen levels just get too low and everything dies.
Sure.
And so if you have a natural fish kill, not where someone has gone in and purposely killed them so we can start over fresh, but a natural fish kill, you generally want to wait for, a good season. If it happened in the summer, wait till the next spring and kind of reassess the fish population, see what's going on, and then make a plan from there.
Is it the same? Let's say we've had a lot of drought, over the last few years, and at least here in the Great Plains we have. If you've got a pond that totally dries out and you're starting fresh because that pond totally dried out, well, we get a whole bunch of runoff the next year, and that pond fills up in the early spring after we've had a whole bunch of rain. We've got a whole bunch of water out there. We've probably got a whole bunch of vegetation structure too, maybe from plants that grew when it was dry and now are inundated or flooded with that water. Is it okay to go ahead and start throwing fish back in there now, or do we want to wait that year again in that sort of situation too?
Yeah, drought is one of those deals that drought brings on a lot of problems with a pond, right? And so thinking about the soil structure, we could have a whole talk about this, but if you start to think about the soil structure, a lot of those different types of soils, bentonite is a common example. Bentonite is just a type of clay, but
Sure.
When we talk about some of these different types of soil or different types of clays, they work well at sealing the bottom of a pond because they suck up a bunch of water and they expand, right? So one of the things that happens when we have a drought is literally all that water in that soil is desiccated out. It gets so dry that then water will inundate, but it takes time for those soils and those clays to kind of expand. So you can see a lot of fluctuation in the pond levels itself. Some of the vegetation you have issues where, if it's terrestrial vegetation and all of a sudden it's inundated with water, it's going to die off. That's going to
Sure.
cause oxygen levels. After a drought, if it dried out your pond, It's a great opportunity to dig it out, to do some maintenance. But I generally recommend, in most cases, not every case, I generally recommend waiting a year, right? So make sure that that pond habitat's going to kind of get back to where it needs to be. You're going to have the aquatic ecosystem booming. You're going to have phytoplankton. You're going to have aquatic invertebrates that are in that system. Then you would add in your minnows or your bluegill, and then either do that in the spring, and out of that fall or the following spring, add in your predators. So really going to reset, and I know it's hard to wait a year after you've had a drought, but that's the best plan of action, I'd say.
So once we've got that pond healthy, you said that early on, you said harvest is important. So how do we go about making a plan for harvesting fish?
Yeah, and so the first thing you need to do is think about, what do you want your pond to be? And so it's amazing how often people haven't thought about that. They want to go catch big fish.
Yeah.
Well, does that mean big bluegill, big catfish, big bass? You want a little bit of everything, or what do you want, right? And so green sunfish, you mentioned that earlier. They're a great fish if you want to be able to take your kid out, your grandkid out, or yourself out, and every cast have a fun little fight, right? You're never going to have a 5-pound bass in that pond, but you're going to have fun times if that's what you like to do. So understanding what you like to do and what you want your pond to be is the first step, right? Because that's going to determine whether you harvest bass or bluegill or catfish, whatever you want to do.
Hang on, don't go any farther. I've got another question.
Rewind.
So if green sunfish are that good at reproducing, and they don't ever get much bigger than a pound, how come they don't get along with bass the same way that bluegill would?
Yeah, so green sunfish have bigger mouths than bluegill, and they're better at eating, and that includes when they are larvae are really, really small. And so what's going to generally happen is that the adults can kind of get along, assuming there's enough food, which there generally is. But the youngins, the larval fish or the small fry and fingerlings, they are better at eating and getting those nutrients and growing up as small fish, which allows their population to kind of take over time and outcompete those bass. Whereas bluegill, they're not going to have that same competitive nature. They're not quite as aggressive when they feed, and they have much smaller mouths. So as they grow, they aren't able to consume a lot of the nutrition that could otherwise go to those bass.
Got it. So it sounds like if we're trying to grow predators, we don't want our forage base to also be a predator that they can compete with.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yep.
That makes sense.
One other thing to mention, too, is that bluegill are really good at making babies. They'll reproduce 3 times in most Kansas ponds. And so green sunfish can reproduce a couple times, but they're not as successful as those bluegill are. And so if we're thinking about those sunfish, those green sunfish or the bluegill as prey, we want them to make offspring that can be eaten by the bass. And so that's another reason that you'd want bluegill and not green sunfish.
That makes sense. I've heard that crappie don't necessarily work good in that system either. Is it sort of for the same reason that green sunfish don't work, or what's the deal there?
Yeah, so a lot of people want crappie in their ponds, and that's great if that's what you want to do. It takes a lot of work, and if you're going to do that, if you have a smaller pond, definitely stick with black crappie. They're not quite as prolific spawners as white crappie. White crappie will tend to take over. But a couple things that they do, they're really good, really good at making offspring, right? And so they can reproduce a lot. Also, when you go fishing for, if you think about when crappie fishing is really good, it's in early spring. One of the first species when the ice starts to break and it starts to feel like spring, you can go catch are those crappie. And that's because they're getting ready to reproduce. So they'll reproduce a little bit sooner than any of the other species that we're talking about. And that kind of gives a jump start to all of their offspring to grow up, right? And so over time, what you see is that you're going to have better recruitment. You're going to have more of those young offspring that are growing up to bigger size classes. And before too long, what you end up with is a whole bunch of crappie that are, stunted, like we talked about earlier. They're really, really small, and you're going to catch a bunch of 4 or 5 inch crappie, but you're not going to see anything bigger than that. So
Cool. So let's say I want to have a pond where I can go out there and I'm happy to tolerate not catching a whole bunch of fish, but when I do catch fish, they're pretty big bass.
Yeah.
How would I harvest in order to achieve that goal?
Yeah, and so there we need to do a couple things. The biggest thing you need to do is harvest bass, right? And so if you want to get really technical, you'd start looking at relative weights, and you would select fish to harvest that have lower relative weights. If you're most people out there, you just start harvesting some bass until you get a certain amount. And so that can vary. If you're in the South, down in Alabama where you're fertilizing your pond, you have a lot of productivity, you might need to take 40 or 50 pounds of bass out of that pond per year.
Wow. And per what unit size?
Yeah, 40 or 50 pounds per acre of water. So surface acre is what we use, probably should be acre feet, but surface acre of water, 40 to 50 pounds of bass per surface acre of water.
That's
right?
a bunch.
In Kansas, most of our ponds are not quite as productive, not productive year round. You're probably looking more at that 10 to 20 pound range. I generally recommend 25 pounds because that's a number where, if you're doing that consistently, you might need to tier that down. But more often than not, what I see is people think that they've gotten more out than they have. So that 25 pounds is a great place to get to. But it kind of depends on that population structure that you have, right? So if you want to, and if you have a bunch of stunted fish, you want to get back to that level, you might have to go out and harvest 50 pounds of 8 or 10 inch bass, right? So it ends up being quite a bit of work. But if you start to do that, you start to establish some of those bigger fish. The other thing we need to think of is the bluegill population structure, right? And so making sure that we have systems in place and habitat in place where young bluegill can grow up and be bigger bluegill, because a 4 pound or 5 pound bass, it will eat a 2 inch bluegill, but really what it wants is a 5 or 6 inch bluegill, right? And so thinking about that'd be the next step to getting really bigger fish. The predators are the biggest issue, so start there. Once, if you feel like you got those nailed down, then you start to manage your bluegill population, and that's kind of how the balance would work with the harvest. Just thinking about harvest, start with your predators. Feel like that you got that really well down. Go down to your prey and start to manage them as well.
Cool. So how would I harvest if I wanted to have a very different pond and I wanted to be able to go out there and catch a bunch of big bluegill?
Yeah.
Because I enjoy eating bluegill a whole lot more than I enjoy eating bass. So what if that's my goal? What do I want to focus on there?
I'm going to, a little tangent, because I do think you made an important point there. A properly cooked bluegill is one of the best fish you can eat. They don't get enough loving. So shout out to the little bluegill in the frying pan. But if you want to get bigger bluegill, you'd have to think about the bass structure. And what we want there is that stunted bass population that I talked about. You don't want a bunch of 5 pound bass running around eating your 6, 8, 10 inch bluegill,
sure.
right? What you want is a bunch of really stunted largemouth bass, and you want to make sure that they can't eat the big bluegill. So you're gonna harvest your big bass, which is the opposite of what I'd normally tell you. Normally I'd tell you do not keep your big bass. Let all those go. Keep the little ones.
Sure.
But if you want to have big bluegill, you're gonna have to take those big predators out. Let those largemouth bass, the smaller ones, overpopulate to where they can't get at those big fish, those big bluegill. And then allow the bluegill population structure to kind of take off. You can harvest a lot more bluegill than you think out of a pond. And so the recommendations there are as high as 30 or 40 pounds in Kansas per surface acre, right? Wow. Per year. And so bluegill are just so good at making babies, and especially if you're taking out, half pound bluegill, that niche will be filled in no time. So it's really hard to overfish bluegill. What is easy to do is to not have enough habitat for the bluegill. So that habitat management thing comes back in, like I said.
Now wait a minute. So you're talking about having to have an overpopulation of bass, yep, and to be able to grow big bluegill. I mean, growing up, there were all kinds of places I went where you weren't catching a bass every other cast.
Sure.
But we caught bluegill as big as my hand.
Yep.
Strip pits,
yep,
state lakes, reservoirs.
Sure.
So how come those places don't have to be overpopulated with bass to be able to grow big bluegill, but my pond does, if that's what I'm trying to do?
Well, there are a lot of differences between a 1 or 2 acre pond and a multiple acre strip pit or reservoir. And so when we start to think about really big lakes, the habitat is a big change, right? You don't have a lot of overlap, or as much overlap in the niche space or the habitat use that they're sharing. So there's a lot of areas for those bluegill to go hide. You can have a bunch of bass in your pond and have a bunch of bluegill if you have the right habitat structure. And so what we need is we would need a lot of places for those bluegill to hide, kind of, tight interstitial spaces where they feel protected. They got a little house around them. The bass can't go eat them. And you need to have very few spaces where those big bass can hang out and surprise or ambush a bluegill. So when you start to talk about really big lakes or reservoirs or things like that, the diversity of habitat is so much greater than you can have in a 1 or 2 acre pond, that it allows for those really unique habitats where a bluegill can just live its life and thrive without worrying about a bass. It's hard to get that in a smaller farm pond or backyard pond that many of us are talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense a lot. Okay, so I don't want to fool with bluegill. I just want to grow big bass. Can I stock minnows every year and achieve that goal?
Yeah, I make the joke all the time that you can buy me a steak or something instead of sending your money to buy minnows all the time. So still waiting for someone to take me up on that offer. But stocking minnows every year is not generally something that you need to do. And that's because if we have a well-balanced pond, our bluegill are making more than enough offspring to feed our bass population, right? The minnows are a great snack. It'd be like putting some Cheetos in front of you here, Drew, right? Yeah. You're going to enjoy eating them. But you're not going to get a lot of value out of those few Cheetos. So the bass will love to eat those minnows. If you like putting them in and watching bass eat minnows, it's a fun thing. But every minnow that you put in there is going to get eaten. And for every pound you put in, you're going to get 1/10 of a pound of growth out of all your fish. So to put in enough minnows that you see substantial growth in your bass population is not something that's realistic. I think for most of us, at least, a pound of minnows, fathead minnows, is somewhere around $12 to $15 right now. And so to get 1 pound of growth in a largemouth bass, you're looking at somewhere around $150, and that's assuming one bass ate all those minnows.
Wow.
Right? And so to do that on a scale where you can see hundreds of pounds or whatever you're looking for, it's not realistic. So instead of putting that money towards those fathead minnows, stocking those, I would recommend you put that towards some type of habitat management.
Sure.
One caveat there, if you have a new pond that is just getting established, absolutely adding fathead minnows to that new pond is something you want to do. It helps jumpstart the pond and make sure there's enough forage base there for the predators you're going to add.
Good. Well, one thing before we wrap up that is kind of a pet peeve of mine, I guess. I am a consumptive user of fish and wildlife. I spend a lot of time thinking about managing wildlife habitat, thinking about managing populations of critters, but eating venison, eating fish, harvesting animals is a big part of why I go and do things. And on social media and different places, just hanging out with friends and stuff, you see a lot of people that are really shaming others for making what they consider to be unethical decisions about harvesting an animal. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess just that, what makes it ethical or not ethical to harvest a big bass or in that sort of thing?
Yeah, I agree completely with that. I think some of the best hunts I've ever been on were shooting a doe. Some of the really best hunts I've ever been on were having the opportunity to kill a trophy buck that I could hang on my wall and deciding that I just want to watch that fella eat or walk by. And I think that most hunters and most anglers, most of the people listening to that show can tell you hundreds of stories like that.
Sure. Right?
I think that we all care and respect we all care and respect the critters that we're harvesting. So I think that is just important to point out, right? What makes it, in my mind, if you want to go harvest a big bass out of your pond and you're following all the regulations, fantastic, right? If you're being ethical, to me, that's ethical.
Sure.
If it's legal to do, we've established as a community that it's legally that these are the requirements to harvest those animals. And I think the next step is you're going to utilize that animal.
Sure.
Right? So if you're going to go harvest a big bass, let's put that into some grease, right? Let it go and consume that for dinner. So I think respecting the animal, understanding what's going on, and then, understanding the implications of that. If you go harvest a 5-pound bass out of your pond, it's going to be hard to replace that critter. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, right? But kind of understanding what's going on. I'd be interested to hear, what does it mean to you? That's a really good question.
Well, we probably just need to have an episode where we talk about this and similar
Sure.
things for the whole episode. But one of the things that I find challenging to chew on my tongue about sometimes, I guess, rather than saying something to somebody, we have fisheries biologists who manage reservoirs and lakes and make decisions about which animals are appropriate to harvest based on the populations that they're seeing when they do their annual sampling and those sorts of things. And it really bugs me when somebody harasses somebody else about harvesting a fish that is a legal fish to harvest in a public body of water, which I know is different from most of what you're talking about. You're talking about somebody's pond, right? But just an example in Kansas, in the bigger reservoirs, you can harvest several smaller blue catfish, or you can harvest one fish over 42 inches or whatever the regulation is. And, lots of people are going to harass somebody that they harvested that 42-inch fish because it took a long time for it to get that age and that sort of thing. But I don't know. If a fisheries biologist deems that it's okay for me to harvest a few of those fish every once in a while, then I'm not going to try to be smarter than the fisheries biologist. Yeah. I'm gonna feel like that's okay if I do it every once in a while.
Well, and you or the people that we're talking about don't have all the information that they do, right? And so the fisheries biologists, all biologists in our state are fantastic individuals that really care about those animals like we just talked about. And so they're not going to do something that the numbers say is a bad decision long term. They want the resource to be there as much or more than we do. And so there are times to harvest those larger fish where it makes sense. I definitely agree. I think that's a great topic for a future episode. So before I go on a tangent, I'm going to stop there.
All right, that sounds good. Well, let's wrap this episode up, Joe. What are the main points that you want people to remember about pitfalls and tips relative to managing fish populations in their pond?
Yeah, a few big things there. I think that if you're thinking about your pond, throwing fish in it without knowing what's going on. So incorrect stocking causes a lot more problems than it helps. Make sure you understand your fish population before you go add more fish to your pond. Harvest is not a bad word, and oftentimes it is necessary in order to have a strong fish community in your pond. So establishing a harvest plan is key. And then habitat management. So, we come back to that and understanding that habitat management isn't kind of a one-time deal, right? We need to revisit that and make sure that we are constantly maintaining the diversity of habitat that we need in our pond. So those are kind of the 3 pitfalls I'd make sure that I mention. And then, get out there and enjoy your pond. So, being around it, it's amazing how much insight you get just being around it. So go catch some fish, go walk around your pond, go enjoy a sunset, whatever you like to do, but get out there and have fun around your pond. I think that's really important.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. That's great advice. And just thank you to our listeners for listening to this podcast. Please go out there and subscribe, leave us a review, and all those things like we always ask you to do. Get out and enjoy nature. We can hunt doves right now. By the time this episode's going to air, there's going to be opportunities to hunt waterfowl and probably archery deer, muzzleloader deer, and all those sorts of things. Watch some football. just get outside and enjoy life.
Don't forget that good fishing that's going on right now, too.
Oh, yeah,
Drew.
fishing. Yeah, get out there and catch some of those blue cats and flatheads that are trying to put on some pounds for the winter and harvest some bass and crappie and walleye and bluegill and green sunfish.
You'll be happy you did when you're dropping them in the grease in a few months.
That's right. All right, thanks, everybody. We'll talk at you again here in a couple of weeks about a terrestrial episode.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.